Okay, for this piece, I'm going to show you how to alter a form on the wheel while it's freshly thrown. So this base here was thrown on the wheel, and you can see where I used my fingers to kind of indent and push out on the clay body and also create a rippled edge. I'm going to replicate some of this with this form that I'm about to throw. I'm working with probably close to 4 pounds of clay. I'm focusing on getting that stuck to the wheel head and centering it visually before I start to physically center. Okay, so one hand on top, one hand behind, and again, my fist is not directly on top of the mound of clay, but rather a little bit off to the side, because we don't want to create a mushroom cap when we are centering. I will work on coning, so kind of squeezing and forcing the clay up vertically, which lets me get to the bottom of the clay and helps me to create a consistent clay body throughout. And I can cone a second time. I always have my elbows locked down into my body. Most often they're kind of resting on my inner thigh or actually locked into my hip bone. And then sometimes I'll flatten the piece out a little bit so it's not quite so tall, and that helps me to open the form. So again, I'm starting with my thumb, very slowly pushing a hole into the middle of the pot to try and reach a depth where the bottom of my pot would be 1/4 to 1/2 of an inch thick. I will then start to pull it open a little bit, and sometimes when I do this I kind of squash the clay back down so it's not so tall and it makes it easier to open. Doesn't matter how short the clay is when I am starting to throw or how thick the walls are. I just want to open and establish my floor. Then I can pull all of that clay up into a taller piece. Compress the rim. Alright, so I'm pulling in the 3 to 4 o'clock position. I am pulling so that my hand on the outside is pushing a little bit harder than my hand on the inside. I want to aim in a little bit, and my goal is to either keep this a cylinder or actually create a volcano shape as I start to thin my walls and pull up the clay. I often will come in and compress the rim in between my throws. I'm aiming for even thickness from the bottom all the way to the top, so 1/4 of an inch, maybe a little thinner. Sometimes I'll use my knuckle instead of my sponge to pull, and it lets me feel the thickness of the clay a little bit better. And then I usually come back in with my sponge and kind of smooth out those indentations. So at this point I am thinning my walls by pulling, but at the same time I'm also starting to shape. And I like to use rib tools sometimes to help me manipulate that form. It strengthens the outside of the pot while I am applying pressure on the inside to belly it out. Slow and steady, a little bit at a time. And so I'm going to replicate that kind of double bubble shape that I had on the picture that I showed you when I first started this video. So right now I'm working on creating the bottom of the pot, and I'm kind of ignoring the top half of the pot. So once I'm happy with the shape here, I can strengthen it by running a rib tool and kind of compressing on the outside. And then I can go in and I can actually start to manipulate the form while it's nice and soft. And I want to do this to the bottom because I don't want to close off the top to the point that I can't reach my hand inside the form. So I'm just going to work on one section at a time, pushing and manipulating that clay to create these indentations, almost like a pumpkin might have. There's so many different things you can do with the clay body when it's nice and soft. And you're also going to notice that as I start to stretch the clay out on this bottom half, the form starts to shrink in height because I'm taking that clay and moving it out horizontally. It's pulling the pot down vertically a little bit. So you want to take things like that into consideration when you think about the overall height of your form. You may need to throw with more clay and actually make a piece that's taller and larger than what you actually want it to look like when it's finished, because as you alter the shape, it's going to change the height and the dimensions. Now, before I can move on to manipulating the top of the form, I need to use a heat gun and strengthen this piece because I've stretched it pretty far and it has thinned the clay out too. So once I've looked at it and have made sure that I'm happy with the bottom, I'm going to get a heat gun and I'm going to focus on drying out this bottom portion of my pot. And I'm really going to focus on this narrow kind of shoulder or the spot of the pot where the manipulation stops and it becomes very narrow. That needs some heat. Otherwise it will start to kind of collapse and sink into the form, and so we don't want that to happen. I'm going to use the heat gun just long enough that it's not sticky. So I'm going to work on heating up the inside of the pot, heating up the outside, really focusing on that narrow shoulder there. And I will be heat gunning for a few minutes, so if you want to zoom ahead in the video a little bit, you can. enough that it doesn't feel sticky. It starts to stiffen up. Now I'm going to work on the top of the pot. So I am actually going to pull the walls up a little bit more on this top portion. And as I'm pulling, I'm kind of bowing it out into a small bowl shape because I want it to match the bottom of the form. I'm being very careful not to put any downward pressure on that narrow space in between the two bubbles. And now I can start to manipulate the top and kind of fold it and flex it and bend it and change that or alter it while the clay is fresh and soft. So I'm just creating a base here, but you could do something like creating a gravy boat and pinching out the pour spout, or a pitcher and doing the same manipulation. And I just want to give this piece a final cleanup.